Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tous. I'm Meredith Preston-McGee. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Global Center for Pluralism and the Paris Peace Forum to this session, Reimagining Democracy and Civic Participation, putting pluralism at the center. I want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers and supporters of the Paris Peace Forum and congratulate them on organizing a hybrid conference this year, and to thank all of you for joining us in the conference in Paris and from around the world today. We have an hour for our session, and so I'm going to thank the panelists in advance for keeping time in their remarks, and apologize in advance if I do have to ask anyone to wrap up quickly so we can make sure that we do keep to time and have enough space for interaction and discussion and questions. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, where we reside as guests on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. For those of you in other parts of the world, you may be aware that Canada is struggling with its own reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. The challenges we face in advancing reconciliation here are a good example of the difficulties in building a truly pluralist society, so an important element to reflect on in all of our discussions about pluralism. At the Global Center, we believe that societies thrive when differences are valued. We all know that diversity in society is a fact, but how we respond to diversity is a choice. Pluralism involves choosing to respond positively to diversity rather than treating it as a threat. It involves the daily decisions and actions that we take as individuals, as organizations, and as societies that either serve to include or exclude. Pluralism manifests itself in these range of choices in different ways in all sectors of society. It's contextual. It will depend on the context. It will depend on the nature of a society's own history. And we're at a time now when pluralism is under massive threat globally. I spoke at the Paris Peace Forum in 2019 and reflected that as the climate crisis represents the existential crisis facing the planet, the connected existential question that faces us as humanity is how to live collectively, productively together. That question at its core is pluralism. And so I think it's particularly fitting as COP26 concludes in Glasgow that we are discussing pluralism at the Paris Peace Forum today. When we see time and again in our work that when space for civic action is contracting, increasing our networks, building new bridges, and reaching across divides is so necessary to carve out new spaces where civic action can take place. And we know that with these huge social challenges we face, it's important to both understand the issues that we're facing and find concrete examples of how actors are working to advance pluralism and develop common understanding, combat prejudice, and foster belonging. And so I'm really excited today to have three panelists who can speak both to how we understand the challenges to pluralism, as well as to some of the concrete actions that are being taken to advance it. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers and then begin to pepper them with a few questions. We're joined today by a really amazing group of individuals whose work really stretches the imagination on how civic action can take place. Two of our panelists are finalists for our Global Pluralism Award at the Global Center, which celebrates pluralism in action by recognizing the extraordinary achievements of organizations, individuals, or governments who tackle the challenges of living peacefully and productively with diversity. So we're really thrilled today to have with us Danny Elazar, the CEO for Hand in Hand, the Center for Jewish Arab Education in Israel. Hand in Hand is a network of bilingual and integrated schools across Israel, providing Jewish and Arab children with the tools and knowledge to create a community of inclusion and acceptance. Its network of schools is the first of its kind for integrated education in Israel, and Hand in Hand's educational philosophy is built on principles of bilingualism, multiculturalism, and identity education, values education, and dialogue. Our second panelist, Aisha Kagai, is a program officer for citizenship at Namati, Kenya. Namati Kenya is the Kenyan chapter of Namati Innovations in Legal Empowerment, a global movement of grassroots legal advocates focused on advancing social and environmental justice by empowering citizens to understand, use, and shape the law. Through its citizen justice program, Namati Kenya trains and deploys paralegals to support members of historically stateless communities to obtain legal identity documents and exercise their civic rights. Our third panelist comes as another important award program one of the scale-up projects of the Paris Peace Forum from 2020. Catherine Bossard is the Secretary General of the Observatoire Féroce, a non-profit organization that works on issues related to pluralism of cultures and religions. Their project, the World Barometer of Cultural and Religious Pluralism, was selected as a scale-up project in 2020 with a goal to develop a tool to measure the level of cultural and religious pluralism within a society, and to look at the intensity of tensions between different parts and the capacity to absorb shocks between different sets of values to preserve the common good. So I'm going to turn to the panelists with a few of my own questions before we open the floor at the end for questions from the audience. So I'd like to just remind you all that we will have this Q&A session at the end, so please start using the live chat on the platform at any time to submit your questions, and we'll make sure the panelists have an opportunity to respond to some of these at the end. Please don't forget to specify who of the panelists you'd like to respond to your question. So I'd like to begin by asking all of you to just reflect on the wider problem that we're facing, this problem of shrinking civic space. We live in such a troubling time with global trends of division and inequality in so many places in the world. And so many of our leaders consider the very idea of pluralist societies a threat. I wanted you to reflect on how you've seen this play out in your individual contexts, and what are some of the main obstacles you see in promoting pluralism, but also reflect on what can be done. So speak to the strategies you have employed to overcome some of these challenges. I thought I would turn first to Catherine, given that the Observatoire is thinking about these in a larger space and reflecting on the trends. Catherine, maybe you can begin thinking about some of these trends and challenges, and then I'll ask Danny and then Aisha to speak about some of these issues in their specific contexts. So Catherine, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Melanie, Meredith, and thank you to the organisers for this roundtable. We don't talk about pluralism enough, and I'm delighted that we can talk about it today. So first of all, the first context, our observatory works with a vision on the world at large, and our approach is, of course, context-based within situations of pluralism. In relation to the challenges and various challenges linked to pluralism and the civic space, I would start with what a partner from Mali said one day. We were talking about a project, and he said, social link is the only thing that remains once all around has failed. And I think he knew that what she was talking about. I thought it was something that was applicable all over the place, this statement. The social link is really what is the key to resilience in society. And actually, when you look at it, social links are under threat, and they're under threat despite the fact that we're in societies that are more and more open, more and more interconnected. That's the whole paradox, actually. Faced with this, there's a fallback on identity that is created and that becomes larger and larger, and we're seeing a true social fragmentation. And this is the case in many societies, and it's the case in all societies at the moment. It's a true pandemic, and it hasn't waited until 2019. It was happening before COVID happened. It's a pandemic of exclusion that takes on different shapes and sizes. And of course, upon this, faced with this pandemic, pluralism, even more than being medication, is also the vaccination, the jab. And just very quickly, pluralism, what we mean by pluralism in the Paris Observatory is a balance between respecting diversity and specificities within a society and a common meaning that brings together all of these specificities around a society project. This balance is always under threat in two ways, by those who want uniformity of all of the components, and on the other hand, threatened by those who wish a form of segregation, a pluralism in the shape of juxtaposition, which also seems dangerous because it encourages, of course, separatism. The issue here, though, is that this pandemic is a real deep trend. We all are aware of it and see it and recognize it. It's often talked about and named. We notice it, but it's difficult to actually measure and quantify. We find it very difficult to see really what it's all about. And the problem is that when one can't evaluate or measure, when we don't understand or know the phenomenon very well, it's difficult to find an antidote, a vaccination. So vaccination pluralism, we need to understand, of course, and better know the virus to know how to produce this vaccination. And this virus, as Meredith said, it goes from one society to another. So all of the situations, some recipes, of course, can work in some situations, but be completely counterproductive in other situations. And that's where we need to be very cautious. At the observatory, that's what we're working on. We're trying to set up a tool that enables us to better understand this virus, the issues to do with pluralism and elements that threaten citizenship within society. And in fact, it takes the shape of an indicator. It's a measurement methodology that means that we can understand the situation of pluralism and see where the areas of weakness in pluralism are and where the weaknesses in the society that's being measured. It's a multi-dimensional indicator that's interested in three areas: private, public, and political areas. And it tries to give a full account of the pluralistic situation. It's a traditional methodology. It's adapted and relevant to each situation, and we work each time with local players on the field. So the purpose is to recommend and formulate recommendations following the measures, and then try and make tools available to all players who can then use these tools. And it starts, of course, with players in civil society, and especially my colleagues and panelists. And these, of course, results can also be made available to decision makers to ensure that they are translated into public policies and taken on a high level, because, of course, we need this to face all of these challenges we're facing.
The opening really nicely for both Danny and Aisha to speak a little bit about what's going on in both of their contexts. I already have some other questions for you, Catherine, but I will return to those in a minute. Danny, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how you've approached these issues through education, which we know to be so elemental for shaping some of the social connections that Catherine's been speaking about.
Absolutely. First, thank you to all the organizers and for this important conference and topic also. And I'd like to talk about, maybe I'll open with how a structure of an educational system can be an obstacle for a pluralistic society. And Israel is a diversified society. And we have here in Israel 80% Jews and 20% Arabs, Palestinians within Israel. And the educational system here is built in a way in which we have different streams. There's a Jewish stream in education, there's an Arab stream in education. Within the Jewish streams, there are also different streams, secular stream and Orthodox stream and so on. And so is the Arab system also split. And it's all part of the public system in Israel. That's how the public system is built in Israel. And in Israel, 99% of the schools are part of the public system. And there are different reasons for why the schools are separated like that. There are historical reasons within Israel, cultural reasons, religious regions, and because we're in a conflict. There's a conflict in this region between Jews and Arabs. And within the Israel borders, the Green Line, it also influences and impacts what's happening within Israel. So there are different reasons to the separation within Israel. And it also, we see it also in the languages. It's a bilingual country. And Jews don't speak Arabic. Most Arabs speak Hebrew because they're the minority within Israel. We're separated many times in the place we live, in the cities. We're separated in the job market there's a lot of separation in Israel between Jews and Arabs for the reasons that I've already spoken about. And what we're trying to do, the way we're dealing with this challenge, is we are challenging actually the public system in Israel. And we're saying it's about time to bridge these streams, to bring them together, to bring students together, because the way you're educated, that has so much influence, of course, on your life. That's what builds your identity, builds your worldview. And the moral and the way to bring people together is to live together. And schools and communities we build around them are the ways to bring people together from childhood, actually. So actually what we've done in Israel is built a network of schools and communities, which, as I said, are bridging the two streams, bringing Jews and Arabs together to study together in a multicultural way where all cultures are part of the school on an equal basis, and the same in the communities. The schools are bilingual. All kids learn both Arabic and Hebrew and study in both languages. And we're bringing an equality into the schools, showing that these schools can be equal, because that's one of the challenges Israel has, is to become also more of an equal society. And we learn from that when we see our graduates for schools. Today we have 7 schools across the country, thousands of students and 10,000 community members, and we see a lot of importance in bringing also the parents into this program. So it's not only for the kids, because also the parents grew up in separate educational systems. So we create communities around the school and bringing everybody together and having them study together, live together on a day-to-day basis, in better days and also in very challenging days we have here in the region, changes the whole way they think and promotes a pluralistic worldview and supports creating shared society, a vision of shared society in Israel. And maybe a bit later I can also give some examples for how this works and what a difference it makes between the way our students grow up in their communities and the rest of society in Israel.
Danny, thank you. And your last point on shared society is sort of maybe where I wanted to jump off and ask Aisha to say a few words about her work in Kenya, because it seems to me that your focus on accessing justice as a tool for belonging is really part of building some of that systemic piece on a shared society, and again, facing some systemic challenges within the wider system there to your work. So maybe Aisha, I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. We work with communities that are Kenyans by law, but are treated differently while accessing identity documents. And we all know identity documents are crucial to accessing any basic right, be it education, health facility, any basic right you think of, you need an identity document in Kenya, and I believe in many countries in the world. And so these communities go through different processes than any other Kenyan community. And Kenya is an ethnic country, really, because in the constitution, we have 45 ethnic communities. You fall under those ethnic communities, you're treated like a Kenyan. You fall under others, you're treated like someone who does not belong. The constitution is quite clear. If you are in Kenya before 1963, after independence, you're automatically Kenyan. If your parents, one of your parents is Kenyan, then you're Kenyan. And so these communities fall under that, but have been treated differently, either because of ethnic profiling or religious profiling. The state knows better. The policies are quite clear. The constitution is a progressive constitution. We are able to work through an approach. Nomad Kenya works with partners, and we use the legal empowerment approach. Why the legal empowerment approach? We realize that these communities have been seeking recognition ever since independence, and Kenya now is close to 50 plus years after independence. And so Probably they lacked the tools and mechanisms on how to go about it, or did not understand the laws clearly so that they use it to ensure that they achieve systemic change. So through legal empowerment approach, we have community-based paralegals in these communities, and they walk through the process with the community, that is in a client-to-client basis, and ensure that they initiate the fast process until resolution. Where there is need to assemble documentation, they assist and help them to understand why the documents are needed. I can tell you for free, these communities do not work it is not an easy walk in the park. Because for me, I did not go through the system, the discriminatory system. I had just to present 3 documents really, my birth certificate, my school living certificate, and one of my parents' ID. But these communities have to work with almost 12 documents, and they have the burden of proof to ensure that they prove they're actually Kenyans in front of a panel that is a composition of the registration officers, CID, CID is the Criminal Investigative Department, the Intelligence Department, police officers. Remember, these are marginalized and minority communities for ages. So when the paralegal work with them through the process, they enable them to garner their confidence and put law in their hands to enable them to be able to present themselves amicably in front of this panel, seeking for a resolution. They understand what the Constitution says vis-a-vis what practice is done at the local level. So through this approach, paralegals are able to document the discriminatory practices, because we know governments have a tendency to decline. And they've declined this in several occasions, that the system is not discriminative. Yes, according to law, it's not, but according to practice, it is. And so through the data collected by the paralegals and is stored in a cloud database known as Salesforce, we are able to deduce trends of discrimination. For example, what questions were you asked during your vetting? So certain questions like, did you call Somalia? This is discriminative. I might have relatives in Somalia. How does that relate to me being Kenyan or not? Or, for example, why do you like eating matoke? Just because Ugandans love matoke doesn't mean I'm a Ugandan. So such trends, we are able to deduce them and even monitor how long does it take for these minority communities to get documents. The statute law is clear, 21 working days or a maximum of 30 working days. So if it is these communities, it goes to an extent of 2 years, but the government will tell you that that is not possible. But from our data, we are able to showcase this, and this is factual empirical data that will enable us to lobby, advocate for systemic change. I don't know whether Meredith answered your question well, but yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Aisha. I have, as you can imagine, a ton of specific questions for all of you. So I'm going to maybe just pose a slightly more specific question to each of you before we go around for another wider space, because there's so much that's come out in this first piece. Catherine, you had mentioned how contextually specific pluralism is, that it finds its expression differently in each society, and I think we at the Global Center really find that as well. But at the same time, there will be core pieces that have commonalities between different societies. I know that you're working in a few different countries right now. We have had a question in the chat curious about where you're working, so if you could maybe mention that. And also if you could reflect on whether or not you've seen good practices connecting across the countries that you're currently working in that we might be able to draw from.
Thank you for your question. For the moment, our observatory works in different countries. We've worked in Central Africa. We used to work there a great deal, slightly less now, but we still do, in Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria. And that you can see it, that if you look at the net, we've worked in other countries, but I'm going to concentrate on the Barometer mainly. The Barometer is in the pilot phase. We're developing the methodology, and we're doing it in 3 pilot countries. The first is Lebanon, Mali is the second, and the third country is France. These are three countries that are on three very different continents. They also have to deal with different issues. The idea behind the Barometer, why did we choose countries that were so different from each other? Well, to see what areas they had in common. Now, what is in common is what we all will find in our methodology. The three areas that I mentioned, the private sphere, public and political spheres or areas have come out of the research on the field, basic research that we've done in these countries to understand the dynamics of the religious aspects in these three countries. And it's quite funny because right in the beginning we were told, well, the religious side of things, if you look for it, you won't really get very much. What's really problematic is the community-based aspects. But when we did our deep research, we realized that there were issues with the religious aspects. So this was very instructive. For the moment, we've seen at this stage, we've been able to see what is problematic. We haven't actually been able to see best practices. In the new phase that's going to happen, based on these criteria that we've been able to highlight, we're going to be able to measure what is actually happening on the field, and based on these elements, we'll formulate recommendations, we'll see which mechanisms regulate the weaknesses, and then write a report that might, or hopefully will be useful to various people and various countries, and then I'll be able to talk about positive elements at that point. Meanwhile, the threats to pluralism in these three countries, what we note is that in Mali, what really threatens pluralism is the the strong influence of extremist groups that also that also affect the state, because the state doesn't regulate them. But we know that pluralism and respecting diversity is a part of their doctrine and their political program. That's threatening things substantially. In Lebanon, we have a memory of war and conflict that's ever present, and that is latent, despite the fact that younger generations wish to forget about it or not think about it all the time. We also have the crisis, but that would take ages to talk about. And in fact, there's a workshop at 4:30 p.m. Please don't hesitate. Get in touch via the forum chat. We'll give you the link. It's just on Lebanon and actually about pluralism in Lebanon and what the situation is at the moment. And then in France, we always have the impression France likes looking elsewhere. We rarely look in our own country at these issues, but we notice that there is a real increase and mistrust of religious aspects and disagreement on secularity and what it actually means, which is mainly linked to the changes in society and a model that is put into question in relation to these different aspects. And above all of this, and this is a general trend, and it goes within all three countries, is all of the media and social network aspects that's threatening pluralism that is not sufficiently regulated, and that is therefore something that is a potential threat. And this is something that we're going to include in our barometer, but in the development phase, because at the moment we're starting with a project that's a slightly smaller size project. Thank you.
Danny, when you were speaking, I was really struck by how you were talking about the creation of a shared society, and that you were challenging the system to be more structurally inclusive, in addition to the very real social connections that you build between students in your classrooms. And I was wondering if you could also reflect a bit on what happens when that shared society that you help to develop meets the segregated society outside. And what does that actually mean? I know that you don't just work in the classrooms, your alumni go forward and do other wider pieces. And so I was wondering if you could just reflect on that, because I think there's a lot for us to learn on other spaces where pluralism can take root.
Right, that's always a challenge, because we're always asked, are you a bubble? Is this for real, or does this have significance? Also, when your students and the parents and the community meet the outside world, I'll put it that way. And so that's always an interesting question. And I think we're a model, we're a beacon for society. We're showing the way. And that's why it's so important for us to have the community life. So it doesn't stay only with the students, it works also with the parents. And when the students graduate, they take it out into the world. And they feel secure enough to do that also. So, of course, it's not easy. But we see that when our alumni, the graduates, when they go out, when they're in the university, wherever they work, that influences their surrounding. I'll give one example. One of the parents of a student in our Galilee school works in a high-tech company. And he has a big majority of Jewish employees, and he also has Arab employees within that organization. And in Israel, it's a custom that every holiday you bring the workers together, have some drinks, and celebrate on the holidays. But it was always only on the Jewish holidays, of course, as a majority. And after they joined the school, and suddenly it came to his awareness, that thanks to the school and thanks to the community life there, learning about the Muslim holidays and the Christian holidays. So he brought into his organization, into the company, the idea and actually the practice of also referring to the Muslim and Christian holidays throughout the year. So, and it's again, you're all the time challenging the system from that point of view, mainly the Jewish majority. You're challenging the system and coming out and saying, this is how it should be. This is how our country, this is how the public sphere of Israel should look like, the same as in the schools and in the communities we have. And of course also, and again, because we're still in a conflict situation, and there are also difficult political days in Israel, which actually there's conflict between Israel and it could be the Gaza Strip, Palestinians in Gaza, and there can be violence within those days also. So it's the whole idea of, even in those difficult days, how do you bring people together? How do we create that vision of shared society, although we're within a conflict? And both sides have their nationalities, the Israeli, the Jewish nationality, the Palestinian nationality. And how do you bring people together also in days of violence or conflict to continue believing and promoting a shared society vision? And maybe I'll give one last example that in May, there was violence erupted again between Israel and Gaza, and it also influenced within Israeli mixed cities. And there were violent sessions between Jews and Arabs within the Green Line. And it was days of vacation of the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr and the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. And we were thinking, how do we bring people back together and say, maybe it's good everybody is on vacation on these days, but after a couple of days we understood how important it is. And as Catherine said, the social media was just very extreme. Also, the regular media was very extreme, and Jews were watching media in Hebrew, and Palestinians were watching the media in Arabic, and they were just pushing against each other. And we brought people together, and we began with the staff, the teachers, the parents, to begin dialogue again, and to talk about how do we continue our lives together here. And then we did the same with the students, of course, and brought everybody back to school after the holidays with a lot of frustration, and also it was difficult days, but the ability to talk to each other, to continue the big mission we have together with a vision of shared society.
Danny, it's so powerful to hear you also speak about how you're bringing people together at moments of real tension and conflict. I think it's often easy for us to have these conversations when tensions aren't that high, but to be able to do it when you know that the risks are particularly great and the emotions run high, but to maintain a focus on what you're doing is really is so inspiring. Aisha, if I could turn to you, I confess I lived in Kenya for many years, including when the new constitution came out and was promulgated. And I know how much pride there is in such a progressive constitution. And I think that there's something really important about separating out the hardware, the constitution, the laws and policies that on paper may look like they are open and inclusive, but then that path to implementation and where you see the discrimination coming through. And some of that can be an unintended consequence of how a constitution or a law is drafted, but some of that is also really at the heart of the social mindsets and the system that isn't written down. It's the sort of the unwritten pieces of the system. And I'd love for you to reflect also on where you have found champions within the system as well, within the government system and others, and some of the examples maybe that you have of how you've been able to advocate successfully for people to see a constitution that they may feel great pride in, but recognizing that it isn't necessarily delivering everything that people would want it to, and see how they might be able to address
that. Okay, thank you, Meredith. That is so true. The Constitution is one thing, but practice is something else. While the Constitution has clearly stipulated who's a citizen, who's not, on what terms is your citizenship, can be revoked by who, we realized as we were having conversation with government personnel that other than the Constitution, there are specific guidelines from the various ministries. And I think things got worse for these communities who are mostly Muslim by faith after various terrorist attacks. So now anyone with a Muslim name would definitely go through more scrutiny while applying for an identity document. And these were the guidelines provided by the various ministries on the reasons that they need to protect the security of the state, which is understandable. But at the same time, while this is being implemented, I think, and this is where now community paralegals and communities themselves have an opportunity to showcase how certain guidelines affect or discriminate them, making them feel like they're not part and parcel of Kenya. So we have tried certain avenues to ensure that we have champions in government. For example, we were privileged to have one of our paralegals become a chief. And so, the first point of application is at the chief's office. At least she now understood the predicaments of these communities, more so because she comes from this community and hence should easily assist communities in applying for these documents. Secondly, we thought of having champions in the legislature, that is parliament. They formulate these policies. During amendments, these policies pass through their house. And so we decided that most parliamentarians, as much as we think that when we elect them, they are qualified to be parliamentarians, it is usually more of a populist, leadership, whereby you're there, you find yourself as a parliamentarian, but you do not know the grievances or how to go about policy formulation. So instances we've had where we had to empower parliamentarians to be in a capacity to understand the situation that communities are going through, even though the Constitution is pro-inclusivity, is pro-non-discrimination, has national ethos towards unity and the nationalhood. We had to make sure parliamentarians understand that in these regulations, there are gaps and loopholes where there are avenues for discrimination. And so we have seen more after engagements with parliamentarians. We have seen caucuses, for example, the pastoralist caucuses, which is a composition of both Muslim and pastoralist communities, come to the forefront and start having discourse around identity issues in the various communities that we work with, and even others that we did not foresee that are experiencing challenges as the communities that we work with. So from this, we were able to have, and we have been in a capacity to have 2 petitions presented in Parliament, one from the Somali community through their Member of Parliament, who had gone through a series of understanding what are the gaps in the system, where can we amend, and since now globally everyone is transitioning to a digital ID, is it the right time for Kenya to transition, knowing that the current system has various discriminatory practices experienced by certain communities. The other petition presented by the Member of Parliament from where the Nubian communities hail was seeking recognition. After various years of Nubians seeking for recognition, Nubians were not in Kenya, but they came here in the 1800s. They came here as British rivals, and they were left here by the British. So what is their fate? If we can recognize stateless communities, why don't we recognize Nubian communities who are not stateless and are not perceived to be Kenyans? So what is their fate? So the petition by the Nubians, which was drafted by the Nubians themselves, after a series of skill building that is on petition writing and having various lawyers present, they now are seeking for recognition. And the Member of Parliament is not from the Nubian community, but was categorical. I liked his speech. He said, even though we are vetting these communities on the basis of security, let us be wary and careful that we do not profile these communities on the basis of religion. A handful of people can be in organized crimes, have ill intentions, but that doesn't mean that you can generalize an entire community. And for me, I felt that was powerful. So those are some champions that we have seen. And we continue to say that, as I said earlier, as Kenya is an ethnic community, just like Dan had said, it is not easy to communicate to the ones who are not affected. And so it was paramount that we felt a minority community with limited numbers cannot bring change in parliament, cannot move government, cannot bring change in the identity system without the support of the mainstream communities. And having people like me who come from a mainstream tribe amplify our voices on behalf of marginalized communities, speaking about the issues and the gaps that are there in the system. And that way, governments are able to hear and listen. And even taking advantage of opportunities like in Kenya, currently our current president has the urge to unify this country, and that being his legacy as he lives his second tenure. So taking advantage of that opportunity that he wants to unify the country, then tell him that we cannot unify the country in political basis. We need to look at economic basis. We need to look at social sector. We need to look at culturally, how do we unify these communities? And so by telling him there are communities that feel as second-class citizens and do not have an allegiance to this state, having been marginalized for very many years and going through various discriminatory practices as they access identity, need to also be recognized. So we've been having certain conversation, and we had an initiative known as Building Bridges Initiative, where our coalition, that is organizations that were working on citizenship rights, drafted submissions that were important to influence conversations of identity under the agenda of inclusivity, so that we can have this issue resolved once and for all. Meredith, I think that's all I can share for now, unless you have any other follow-up question.
Aisha, thank you so much. And I think you've given some really powerful examples as well about how the work that you do can have impact in a whole bunch of different spaces as well. It isn't just in civil society. And we think about, we're talking about the closure of civic space in this panel. And I feel like what all of you are talking about is how you actually start to expand it back by identifying different champions in the private sector, in legislature, and so forth. We are coming through, we've got 15 minutes left, and so what I want to do is pose one of the questions from the chat, connect it to a question that I have, and we'll go around, I think, one more time. That's probably what we have time for. If there are other burning questions, I do advise audience members to get them in there quickly. One of our audience members has asked how we use more inclusive and accessible language in order to better engage civil society about civic space and relate to their own lived experiences. And I think we see this a lot, that people need to see themselves in these questions. And Aisha, to your point about the mainstream society, often they don't see that it's a problem because it's not happening to them. Right. And so, Danny, when you talk about a business saying, oh, wait a minute, we're only celebrating the Jewish holidays, we haven't noticed that before. So how do you use language in that space? I would then, the other piece to my question is, what are some of the spaces that we're missing? Because we've now talked about the private sector, we've talked about legislature. You're all working in civil society spaces largely as well. And so we've talked about that. You've all referenced the challenges of information, misinformation, and the power of social media and social narratives. So what are the bits that we're missing that could help us amplify and even sort of improve and build on the amazing work that all of you are doing? What I might do is I'm going to do it in reverse this time, just to shake things up a little bit. And also then, Catherine, you might reflect on these sort of bigger issues as at the closure. So Aisha, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to go back to you with those questions. Just if there are other areas that you feel we can be engaging more in and how we use that language. So Aisha, I'm going to go back to you.
I can remember when we wanted to reach out to mainstream media, we had to sit down, like we have practically messages for how do we approach the mainstream communities. How do we approach the mainstream communities? Because they don't face these challenges. How do we also approach our communities that we work with to realize a shared challenge? Remember, there are different communities. There are Nilots, there are Kushites, there are Bantus. They're very different in various ways. They have various challenges, but with regards to identity issues, they have shared challenges. And we had to document what messages can we share with these communities that are affected from diverse places in Kenya that would create consciousness to believe that and to see that they have shared challenges when we talk about identity issues. Then for the mainstream communities, it was just evident that we needed more stories. I can tell you, Meredith and the panel, talking about identity issues is touching on security, and in Kenya, it was never allowed. So speaking with mainstream communities, we could not speak any deeper than having real-time stories. And this real-time stories on all platforms, taking advantages on all platforms. Mainstream media, which I think is a social agent that is currently curtailed in Africa. I don't know globally, but in Africa today and in Kenya precisely, I remember when we were transitioning to digital identity and we needed airtime, we needed audience with mainstream media, all those were locked. And the conversation that was being spread in media houses is that you have to move to the next phase of identity system. So what is left is social media platforms, and the pandemic has proven that we have other tools. We have social media, we have Twitter spaces nowadays, we hold Twitter spaces with people who even we do not know. We discuss identity issues. We have apps whereby we can share SMSs. You send SMSs to empower communities. On the updates, new legislation, anything. We have certain platforms like the SMS platforms where we can have conversations with our communities. We have WhatsApp bots whereby people can just text in questions and get someone on the other side to give them feedback. How do I approach the registrar? What is the process like? How do I maneuver? You don't necessarily have to have a paralegal situated in your location if there is not enough resources for that. So we were very deliberate in what messages we were going to share. And I can tell you sometimes we had to share soft messages, but at times as civil society, we were pushed to come in a little bit aggressive to ensure that we are heard. But one thing we've realized that in Africa, as we are talking about civic space shrinking, there is no space for civil society to be heard. The narrative that gets communities to have a buy-in when governments are speaking is they're selling a Western ideology. They have been funded. And that funding is what they're trying to sell onto you. And so when you go to communities and that notion is already spread out there, you have a hard time to counter that narrative. So what did we decide? We're going to have ambassadors in our communities who are going to speak and voice out their issues. I will give you one small example, briefly. We had the Makonde Walk who had been stateless for such a long time, and nothing was coming in concrete. We had approached government personnel. We were having solutions that were not long-lasting. It did not reflect in policy. We did not know the fate of stateless communities. And so the Makonde decided, as a community, we know the law, we know how to use it. It is high time we walk to State House. Remember, the Makondes live way far, the coastal region, some kilometers away from Nairobi City, where the president's State House is located. And they did walk. And when we reached the president's offices, or the president's, what we would call in the global world White Houses or whatever, he said, I do not want to speak with any civil society organization. If I am to listen to this community, it has to come from this community. And so we said, fine, well and good. We identified the chairman, Mr. Nguli. Go ahead and speak on behalf of your community. Since he was empowered, since he understood the gaps in the system, he articulated the issues of the Makonde, and they're now declared the 44th tribe in Kenya and can now have access to identity documents. So now with civil society not having that opportunity to present on behalf of communities, equipping communities with tools, with skills, with the legal knowledge on how to maneuver and articulate their issues as though civil society has done it on their behalf. Is there a question I've forgotten? I think the last question, or that is okay with you, Meredith?
I'm going to pause you for a second. We might have a moment to come back to you, but I do want to make sure that Danny and Catherine have a chance to come in, because I've just been pinged that we only have 5 minutes left, and I promised to be very, very strict. But I think your Makonde example is such a powerful one of community direct speaking to the power of pluralism. Danny, I wonder if you might just reflect on those questions for a couple of minutes, and then Catherine, I am going to give you the last word.
Okay. Firstly, I just want to thank Aisha. You're so inspiring, and your story is so inspiring. And this is already, I'm so happy I'm on this panel for this. So thank you. I'll be brief so we leave time. I'll talk literally about language. Hand in Hand teaches both languages, Hebrew and Arabic, in our schools, and also many of the parents study the language. Mostly Jewish parents study Arabic because the Arab parents know Hebrew. And it creates such a change in your state of mind of how you look at other people and your pluralistic views and the way you accept the other people when you know both languages, because language is not only how to communicate, it's not only a means of communication between people, it's also a bridge between cultures. Because when you accommodate with a language, listen to it, you can you learn more and learn about the cultures, the literature, the art, the music. Then you celebrate the diversity instead of seeing it as a threat. Because many times when you hear somebody who you see as a maybe as enemy even something, or somebody you're in conflict and you hear people speaking and you don't understand what you're saying, it's a threat. When you suddenly understand the language and learn about the culture, then you're celebrating the diversity and you have a whole new world. Suddenly there's a whole new world around you which you can really enjoy and celebrate. I think that's one of the main topics. And then also your identity. We don't want people to blur the identity. We want them to deepen their identity wherever they come from, or whatever religion or nationality or any other means of identity they have. But we want them to widen their identity, to learn how to accept other identities and to enjoy it, not to feel it as a threat. And I think that's one of the main issues of pluralism. How do you create, and you have to be strong in your identity in order to do that. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do and create that language within our schools of celebrating that diversity. We can really promote the vision of shared society. So, and thank you very much. And these are my last words. So I just want to thank you very much for having us on this, having me on this panel.
Great. Danny, thank you so much. And Catherine, as we're coming to the close, I'm going to hand over to your last reflections, particularly on this issue of language, and before we thank everyone for their time.
Thank you very much, Meredith. I don't know if I could talk directly about language, but the two co-panelists gave some very good examples of how you can really put pluralism into action. It's very inspiring with regard to languages, the citizenship, and what is the difference between political decisions and what happens in the field. There's often a big gap between political powers and the field, and it's important to try to connect the two. And that's what we are trying to do with our barometer. Indeed, what you can do and what we're trying to do is to make pluralism something that is better taken into account. We talk about pluralism, but it's never directly addressed. And what we would like to see is we would like to show proof that it's important to integrate the notion of pluralism into economic situations, development aid, public policy. It should be present in all of these decisions. That is the key to a resilient society. We cannot leave it by the side of the road. For me, I think it's similar to our rising awareness of environmental problems. Often when an issue is very complex, it is the world of science that shows us the problem, that shows us the issue, and then civil society takes it up, and civil society can start putting together action plans, raise awareness, and push decision makers into creating public policy that takes these issues into account. Civil society can't do everything on itself. We must have a collective effort of all stakeholders. And that's what our organization would like to do, is to be like scientists, showing the evidence, showing the proof of the problems created by lack of pluralism, and then encouraging, fostering change. But the subject today is not which changes we want to bring about, but there are lots of actions that are possible indeed. And we're hoping to create a platform where we can share good practices indeed, because it's too important to leave it by the side of the road as we move forward.
Catherine, thank you. I could quite literally speak to all of you for the entire day, at least on these issues. I feel like we've just had a really rich beginning of a discussion that is to be continued. over the next year. We're so thrilled to be able to work with our Global Pluralism Award finalists on so many of these issues. I hope this will be an issue for the Paris Peace Forum again next year. And I just want to thank all of you. I think that there's real power in these ideas of being able to speak on these challenging issues in times of crisis, to mainstream communities who may not understand these things, to political leaders, the power of education offering a new language and a new understanding. And I think, Danny, finally also to your point about deepening our own identities to embrace the identities and cultures of others around us. I think it can be all of these things. It isn't an either or. And that's what's so critical when we think about how we champion pluralism. So again, I just want to thank all of you. I would like to thank the organizers again for putting this together on this amazing online platform, and look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you. Merci. Asanteni sana. Shukran.
Thank you.